The date is July 3, 1943. The Russian steppe is a vast emerald sea under a sun that feels like a physical weight on the back of your neck. But for Obergefreiter Hans Weber, the heat isn't coming from the sun. It's coming from the 700 horsepower Maybach HL 230 engine sitting in front of him. Hans is 32 years old, a veteran of the 1941 push into Russia. He has spent the last 2 years fixing Panzer Is and IVs with baling wire and stolen parts. But today, he is looking at the future. He is standing at the railhead near Belgorod, watching as the massive flatbed rail cars unload the first batch of Panther Ausf D-tanks. They are beautiful. To a man who has spent his life in the grease and oil of armored warfare, the Panther is a masterpiece. It has sloped armor that makes the Soviet T-34 look like a toy. It has a long-barreled 75mm gun that can punch through a brick wall at 2 kilometers. It has wide tracks designed to float over the Russian mud. The saviors of the East, the propaganda officers call them. Hans watches as the crew's young boys, mostly with clean uniforms and eyes full of a terrifying certainty, climb into the hatches. They believe the machine is invincible. Hans, however, is looking at the oil stains on the rail cars. "Check the final drives," Hans shouts to his team of mechanics. He knows the math of death for a new machine. The Panther was rushed from the drawing board to the battlefield in less than a year. It hasn't been tested. It hasn't been broken. And in Russia, if it hasn't been broken, it will break at the worst possible moment. As the first Panther starts its engine, the sound is a deep, predatory growl. But to Hans's trained ear, there is a metallic tink hidden in the roar. A sound of gears that aren't quite meshing. A sound of a masterpiece that is about to fall apart. The march to the assembly area is only 15 kilometers. It should take an hour. It takes 5. Hans is riding in a Stikov D9 FAMO recovery vehicle, the heavy half-track loaded with spare parts and tools. He is following the column of Panther Brigade 10. The dust is so thick you can taste the iron in it, and then the column stops. A plume of thick, oily black smoke is rising from the rear of Panther 132. Hans jumps from the FAMO before it even stops moving, his heavy wrench in hand. He runs toward the tank, the heat from the engine deck already singeing his eyebrows. "Get out! Get the extinguishers!" he screams at the panicked crew. The engine compartment of the Panther is a masterpiece of compact engineering. It is also a death trap. To keep the tank low and the armor sloped, the engineers crammed the massive V12 engine into a space with almost no ventilation. The fuel lines are made of a synthetic rubber that can't handle the heat of a Russian summer. Hans pulls the release lever on the engine deck. A wall of flame leaps out, fueled by leaking gasoline. He empties 2 fire extinguishers into the hole, the white powder mixing with the black smoke. When the fire finally dies, the engine is a melted ruin of aluminum and rubber. What happened? The young lieutenant in command of the tank asks, his face white with shock. "We only drove 10 kilometers. Hans doesn't answer. He is looking at the fuel pump. It is cracked under the pressure. The math of death is simple. The engine is too powerful for its own cooling system. The Panther isn't being killed by the Soviets, it is committing suicide. By the time they reach the assembly area, 2 more Panthers have caught fire. 16 others have broken their final drives, the complex gears that turn the tracks. The steel graveyard has begun before the first shot has even been fired. The night of July 4th is a symphony of clanking metal and whispered curses. The assembly area is a forest of camouflage nets and oil drums. Hans hasn't slept in 48 hours. His hands are black with grease that no soap can remove. His fingernails are torn, his knuckles raw. He is under the belly of Panther 204, trying to replace a broken torsion bar. The tank weighs 45 tons, and every time he turns a bolt, he feels the massive weight of the machine pressing down on him. It is the human burden of the mechanic, the knowledge that if he fails, 5 boys will die in a steel box. "Hans, you need to see this," his assistant Klaus whispers. Hans crawls out from under the tank. Klaus is pointing toward the horizon. The Soviet lines are silent, but every few minutes a flare goes up, illuminating the vast network of trenches and anti-tank ditches the Red Army has spent months building. "They know we're coming," Klaus says. Hans looks at the row of Panthers. They look like prehistoric monsters in the moonlight. But he knows the truth. Out of the 200 Panthers that arrived at the railhead, only 184 are still operational. And operational is a generous word. Most have leaking seals, overheating engines, or gears that are stripping themselves bare with every turn. We are sending them into a wall of fire with machines that catch fire on their own, Hans says, wiping his hands on a rag. The order for Operation Citadel has been signed. At dawn, the largest tank battle in history will begin. Hans looks at his wrench. It feels small and useless against the industrial scale of the disaster that is coming. 05 WRAM. July 5th, 1943. The earth shakes. It isn't the tanks. It is the German artillery, thousands of guns firing at once, a wall of sound that feels like it's tearing the air apart. Hans stands by his FAMO, watching as the Panthers move forward. They are beautiful in the morning light, their long guns pointed toward the Soviet lines. But the beauty is short-lived. As the Panthers enter the no-man's land, they hit the minefields. The Soviets haven't just laid mines. They have laid mine belts, thousands of mines per kilometer, stacked on top of each other. Boom! Panther 101 hits a mine. The massive wide track is blown off, the steel links flying through the air like shrapnel. The tank is mobility killed, stuck in the open, a stationary target for the Soviet anti-tank guns. Hans and his team move forward in the FAMO. This is the most dangerous job on the battlefield, recovering a disabled tank under fire. They drive into the smoke, the smell of cordite and burning rubber filling their lungs. "Hook it up fast," Hans screams. They jump out of the FAMO, dragging the heavy steel towing cables. The Soviet 76mm anti-tank guns are already finding the range. Whiz-crack! The shells pass inches over their heads, the sonic boom deafening. They hook the cables to the Panther's towing eyes. The FAMO groans, its engine straining to pull the 45-ton beast out of the mud. As they pull away, Hans looks back. He sees 3 more Panthers smoking in the field. One has hit a mine, the other 2, their engines have simply given up. By midday, the steel graveyard is growing. The field is littered with Panthers. Some are missing tracks, others are missing turrets. But most are just sitting there, their hatches open, their crews gone. Hans is working on a Panther that has a jammed turret ring. He is standing on the engine deck when he hears a sound that makes his blood run cold. A high-pitched, metallic clatter. T-34s, someone shouts. From a nearby tree line, a dozen Soviet T-34s emerge. They are not as sophisticated as the Panther. They don't have sloped armor that is as thick. They don't have guns that are as long. But they have something the Panther doesn't. They work. The T-34s charge across the field, their engines roaring. They don't stop to aim. They fire on the move. Their 76mm shells bouncing off the Panther's thick front armor. But they aren't trying to pierce the front. They are trying to get to the sides. Hans watches as a T-34 circles a disabled Panther like a shark. It fires once into the thin side armor. The Panther erupts in a massive fireball, the turret being blown 50 feet into the air. The math of death, Hans whispers. The Panther costs 3 times as much as a T-34. It takes 4 times as long to build. And yet, here on the field of Kursk, the master race's engineering is being overwhelmed by the Soviet tractor philosophy. The Soviets don't care about masterpieces, they care about numbers. For every Panther Hans fixes, the Soviets build 10 T-34s. The rains come on the 3rd day. The Russian steppe, once a sea of dust, becomes a sea of Rasputitsa, the bottomless mud that swallowed the Wehrmacht in 1941. The Panther's wide tracks were supposed to solve this. But the mud in Kursk is different. It is a thick, clay-like soup that gets between the Panther's interleaved road wheels, the complex system of overlapping wheels that provide a smooth ride. The mud packs into the wheels and then freezes or dries, turning into a solid block of concrete. The tracks jam. The final drives, already strained by the weight of the tank, simply snap. Hans is knee-deep in the cold slime, trying to dig out the wheels of a Panther that is bogged down. He is using a shovel, a crowbar, and his bare hands. The mud is freezing, his fingers losing all feeling. "We have to leave it, Hans," Klaus says, his voice hollow. "The Soviets are only 2 kilometers away." Hans looks at the tank. It is a brand new Panther, its paint still fresh. It hasn't even fired its gun in combat. And now, It is being abandoned because of a handful of mud. This is the end of the myth, Hans says. He reaches into the cockpit and pulls the self-destruct charges. As they run back to the FAMO, the Panther disappears in a muffled crump of explosives. The steel graveyard is now a mud graveyard. Out of the 200 Panthers that started the battle, only 40 are still in action. The rest are either burnt-out hulks or abandoned monuments to over-engineering. The final days of the battle are a blur of cannibalization. Hans's repair shop is a clearing in a forest hidden from Soviet planes. It is filled with Rex tanks that are too damaged to fight but still have a few working parts. Hans is a scavenger now. He takes a transmission from one tank, a fuel pump from another, and a gun sight from a third. He is building Franken-Panthers machines made of the dead to keep the living moving for one more day. The stress is absolute. Every time a Panther leaves the shop, Hans wonders if it will make it 5 kilometers. He feels a crushing sense of guilt every time he sees a crew climb into a tank he knows is held together by hope and stolen bolts. The math of death has changed again. It isn't about victory anymore. It is about delay. They are no longer the saviors of the East. They are the rear guard of a dying empire. Hans looks at a letter from his wife in Berlin. She writes about the wonder weapons that will win the war. Hans looks at the pile of broken gears and burnt-out engines. He wants to tell her the truth. He wants to tell her that the wonder weapon is a beautiful lie that is killing their sons. The Battle of Kursk ends not with a breakthrough, but with a quiet withdrawal. The Operation Citadel has failed. The German army has lost its last chance to win the war in the East. Hans is standing on a hill, looking back at the battlefield. Through his binoculars, he can see the steel graveyard. It is a landscape of blackened metal. Hundreds of tanks, German and Soviet, are scattered across the steppe like the bones of giants. But the majority of the bones are German. He realizes then that the Panther wasn't just a tank. It was a symptom of a sickness. The sickness of a nation that believed its will and its genius could overcome the cold reality of industrial production. The Soviets didn't win because they were brave. They won because they were logical. They built a tank that was good enough, and built it in numbers that the masterpieces could never match. We built a Swiss watch to do the job of a sledgehammer, Hans says to Klaus. Klaus doesn't respond. He is looking at the horizon, where the first Soviet T-34s are already moving forward, reclaiming the land they lost a week ago. The tide has turned, and it is a tide of steel that no mechanic can stop. Years later, Hans Weber would work in a factory in West Germany, building trucks for a world that wanted to forget the war. He would see the new designs, the new engineering marvels. He would see the same obsession with complexity, the same belief that a better machine is always a more complex machine. He would visit the museum at Münster and stand before a restored Panther Ausf. He would look at the sloped armor and the long gun. People would walk by and comment on how advanced it was for its time. Hans would look at the final drive housing. He would see the same weak points he had tried to fix in the mud of Kursk. He realized that the ghost of the Panther was still there, the ghost of a machine that was too good for the world it was built for. He met a Russian veteran once, a man who had been a mechanic for a T-34 brigade. They sat in a small cafe in Berlin and shared a bottle of schnapps. "Your Panther," the Russian said, laughing. "It was a beautiful girl, but she couldn't cook, she couldn't clean, and she fainted at the sight of mud." Hans laughed too. "And your T-34? "The T-34 was a peasant woman," the Russian said. "She was ugly, she smelled of oil, and she was loud. But she could work 20 hours a day and never complain." The story of the steel graveyard is not a story of a great battle. It is a story of the moment of realization, the day a mechanic realized that his tools were no match for the industrial reality of the modern world. Hans Weber died in 1985. In his workshop, they found his old wartime wrench. It was worn smooth by years of use, its steel polished by the grease of 100 different machines. The Panther is now a legend, a symbol of German engineering. But for those who know the truth, it is a warning. It reminds us that the math of death doesn't care about beauty or genius. It only cares about what works when the mud is deep and the enemy is coming. As the sun sets over the fields of Kursk today, the steel graveyard is gone. The metal has been recycled, the bones buried, the craters filled with wheat. But if you walk through the fields after a heavy rain, you might still find a piece of a interleaved road wheel, a fragment of a masterpiece that failed. Hans Weber's story ends with a quiet understanding. The wonder weapons are gone, but the human burden remains. Because in the end, the only thing that survives the fire is the truth.